Welcome everybody. People are joining. My name is Stefano Feltri. I'm a journalist. I work as communication advisor for the Institute for European Policy Making, and I'm very happy to chair this meeting, which is one of the very first events that are connected with our new media fellowship, which means that basically we are trying to create a long-term relationship with journalists, commentators, editors who really shape the conversation at European level in their respective fields. We are building a group of people with a diversity of expertise, seniority, geographical connections. And today we are here to discuss a topic that has become increasingly relevant since we decided to host this meeting, which is the importance of deterrence, and especially focus on Taiwan, but with the framework that obviously includes what is going on in Ukraine. The opportunity for this meeting comes from a recent publication by our friend Bill Emmott. It's an Adelphi book in Adelphi is published in cooperation with the Institute for Strategic Studies, dedicated exactly to this topic. Bill Emmott, and also I introduced the other guests, and then I'm going to present more formally both of them. The other guest is Mariangela Pira. She's a host and an anchor at SkyTG24, and also I have to mention she is one of the most well-known commentators on social network, especially LinkedIn and podcasts. But I mean, she built a real audience on LinkedIn, commenting current events with a specific attention to financial and economic issues. So let's start to present more formally Bill Emmott. As you probably know, Bill Emmott, in Italy, we all remember him because of his tenure as editor-in-chief of The Economist, and because of the very famous clash with Silvio Berlusconi that he defined unfit to lead Italy. But before and after that, Bill Emmott is an expert in international security, and we were discussing before the meeting, she has a 4 decades long expertise in Asia that started developing when he became foreign correspondent in Japan more than 40 years ago for The Economist. Now, Bill Emmott is chairman of the IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies, Trustees, and he also has a Substack newsletter, and he is a consultant, a commentator. You can read his columns also on the Italian daily La Stampa. Mariangela Pira, as I was mentioning, she's a host and an anchor at SkyTG24, and she also has an expertise in Asia. She has worked for some years as a foreign correspondent over there in China, and she traveled all around the region in Taiwan and other countries. And we are here to discuss this book called Deterrence, Diplomacy, and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. Bill published this book, I think in September, October, and the autumn 2024. And now this book is becoming a very useful framework to interpret what's going on in Ukraine and to remember a key concept in international relations, which is deterrence. If you read the recent policy brief published by our institute, the Institute for European Policy Making by Andrea Gilli, it's called Before Vegetius, which means if you want peace, you need to prepare the war. In that policy brief, it's very clear that you cannot apply the usual analytical tools to military expenditure. You do not always buy weapons because you intend to use them. Sometimes you build up weapons, you prepare your army because you don't want to use them, but you just want to shape the action of your strategic competitor. Which means that in this conversation, we're not discussing why war is inevitable. We are focusing on how to prevent war or how to minimize the damages. This is a probably a necessary premise for such an educated audience, but it's when you discuss these issues in the media, it seems that if you discuss war, it means that you support war, and if you talk about peace, it means that you want peace. Sometimes the opposite is true. Okay, with no further ado, I give the floor to Bill for his presentation. Then Mariangela will act as a discussant. She will interact with Bill, and then we will open the floor for Q&A questions. In the meanwhile, you can write your question in the chat, and or you can raise, I think, your digital hands if you want to have the floor afterwards. Okay, Bill, thank you again for being with us, and also I forgot to mention it, for us accepting becoming one of our media fellows, as also Mariangela Pira did. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefano, and I'm delighted to be both a media fellow for the IEP and also to be in this discussion with you and Mariangela. I did write this book essentially in 2023 and early 2024, then published 6 or 8 months later. I think the first question to answer is, why did I write this book? Why did I decide to write this book? The simple answer, whenever one writes a book, is because you want to learn about something. You don't write a book because you know it, you write a book because you want to understand it. Why did I want to understand the situation in East Asia surrounding Taiwan? Well, the simple start to that is that, exactly as Stefano said, I lived in Japan in the 1980s. I've written about Japan really over 40 years. And I wanted to understand something that had happened in 2022 in Japan, which was that Japan, which had been tied by its post-war constitution from 1940s, imposed by the Americans, to having a very minimal defense spending, limited informally to less than 1% of GDP, such that in all my time reporting on Japan, I realized I'd never actually been inside the defense ministry, because there'd been no interesting stories related to the defense ministry. I was always in the Ministry of Finance or the Bank of Japan or the Foreign Ministry or other places. And suddenly in 2022, they announced they were going to double the share of GDP devoted to defense, new national security strategy, dedicated to expanding their contribution to deterrence of China and North Korea, and in parentheses, Russia, in East Asia. So I, of course, wanted to understand, what does this really mean? Can they really contribute? And what are they seeking to achieve by this rather dramatic change? But secondly, as chair of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, I attend a big event in Singapore every year, the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is really the premier event, almost the Davos for defense and security ministers in Asia, always opened by the US Secretary of Defense. Always then there's a reply from the Chinese Minister of Defense. It's a big event with people from all around the region. And throughout the last 4 years, Secretary of State Austin, the Biden administration Secretary of Defense, had in every speech said that their strategy was something he called integrated deterrence of essentially a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or of other coercive activities. What does this mean, I thought? And to what degree could Japan contribute to this integrated deterrence? And then thirdly, of course, the big reason is, as Stefano said, Ukraine. The reason for Japan's big announcement was that in that year, Russia had made its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Japanese Prime Minister had said as the keynote speaker at the Shangri-La Dialogue for the IISS, he'd used the phrase, "What happens in Ukraine today could happen in East Asia tomorrow." So it was clear in Ukraine that if we had had a deterrent strategy against a Russian invasion, it had failed. So the very relevant question one had to ask was, what's the deterrent strategy towards China, and can it succeed? Or are we in a new era of imperial conquest in which the great powers, in particular Russia and China, decide to annex territory in the way that countries used to in let's say the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, and then, of course, between the First and Second World Wars. And China and Russia on February the 4th, 3 weeks before the full invasion of Ukraine, had issued a joint statement when Putin went to Beijing. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin issued a joint statement saying, we want to undermine the Western way of running the world. We want to change the way in which the world is run. So this was the vital reason why I decided to look at this. And then once I began to look, I could see actually how high the stakes in Taiwan and around Taiwan really are. As soon as you look, you can see at it, you can see that this is not a contest over a small offshore island, a little piece of territory. This would be, if it were to happen, a contest between the two most heavily armed superpowers in the world, the two powers contesting global leadership in the 21st century, the two powers, therefore, both of whom would have a lot to lose in such a conflict. We had seen in Ukraine that Vladimir Putin had used the threat of use of nuclear weapons as, in a way, a form of shield for his conventional invasion. By threatening nuclear weapons, he sought to discourage European countries and the United States from supporting Ukraine as energetically and as fully as they might have done. So the open question then is, we had been used during the Cold War to the idea that deterrence in a world in which the superpowers all have nuclear weapons could guarantee there were no wars, because the risks of starting a conventional war between America and the Soviet Union were so high, they would destroy the planet once it escalated to a nuclear use. At least we understood that after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, that the risks were so high that actually there was no conventional conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. But what Russia's invasion of Ukraine had done was show that actually in the modern, more complex world, you could use nuclear weapons actually as a threat to act as a cover for making a conventional invasion. So this is the reason for taking Taiwan extremely seriously. Its importance is not simply its existence as an island or even its history, although I will talk about that briefly now, but rather the fact that it would represent a US-China conflict, which would have a high risk, I think, of turning nuclear if it were to begin. So I'm just going to quickly show some maps, slides, if I can share my screen. This one. There. I hope everyone can see that. So quickly, so first of all, the book. This is, of course, the English version for the Institute for Strategic Studies. Very sober, scholarly title, Deterrence, Diplomacy, and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. I can't resist telling you that I sold the Japanese rights to a Japanese publisher who used the title How to Stop World War III, which I think you'll agree is a little snappier. Now, I think it's important just quickly to understand the history of Taiwan. Why? Because the Chinese narrative around Taiwan is that, to quote the official Chinese line, Taiwan has been an inalienable part of China since ancient times. So the implication is that China has a long-term historical claim to Taiwan. This is blatantly untrue. It's not to say there's no historical claim, but it is absolutely untrue that Taiwan has been a part of China since ancient times. The early inhabitants of Taiwan, really until the 14th and 15th centuries, were essentially Polynesian, people who'd come from far away across the Pacific. Also Chinese settlers from the mainland, but actually acting against the orders of the imperial rulers. Then in the 16th century, Spain and then Holland set up small colonial outposts on the island. 1661, a Chinese pirate who was a rebel against the Qing dynasty, who were then in power on the mainland, conquered the island, drove away the Spanish and the Dutch and suppressed the locals and ran the island for 2 decades until in 1683, the Qing dynasty decided that they would actually like to control Taiwan and conquered it. So the beginning of Taiwan being ruled from Imperial China is 1683. So by the time Taiwan is then handed over to Japan as a colony after the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, Taiwan has been part of China just for 200 years. That's not nothing, but it's not since ancient times. So Japan then runs Taiwan for the first half of the 20th century. Then with the defeat of Japan in 1945, the then government of China, nominal government of China, the Kuomintang, the nationalist party, considered Taiwan to be part of what they called the Republic of China at the time. And then when they were defeated by Mao Zedong's communists in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek, the generalissimo, as he called himself, the ruler of the Republic of China, then went into exile in Taiwan and essentially set up a dictatorship in Taiwan, together with a lot of settlers from the mainland who escaped with him, and that's been the status of Taiwan ever since. Starting in the 1980s under Chiang Kai-shek's son, but then fully in the mid-1990s, Taiwan became a democracy. And that is the status now. The 23 million residents of Taiwan have a full and flourishing liberal democracy. So China's historic claim to Taiwan is really not about ancient control. It is about Taiwan as being like an unfinished piece of unfinished business from 2 wars of the 20th century, or the late 19th and early 20th century. The Sino-Japanese War, which China lost to Japan and then handed over Taiwan in 1895, and above all, the Civil War against the nationalists, which the communists won in 1949, and the unfinished business of that civil war in China is Taiwan. So that is the true nature of China's historic claim to Taiwan. It is not about Taiwan having been a historic part of China, really. What is the importance of Taiwan strategically? A lot of places were historic parts of China. Mongolia was a historic part of China, part of the Qing dynasty China. China is not making a claim for Mongolia. Mongolia was as long a part of China as Taiwan has been part of China. So why is Taiwan important? Well, it is partly that 20th century Civil War history, of course, but secondly, it's strategic. It is Taiwan's location. Taiwan is located just inside what is known to strategists as the first island chain, coming up from the Philippines and Indonesia, going up through the southern Japanese islands, past Okinawa to Japan, all strategic barriers to maritime movement into the East China Sea and the South China Sea. The red line on the right is known as the second island chain, and that takes you to Guam. Currently, no one controls that region. The US has bases in Okinawa and, of course, in Korea. Used to have bases in the Philippines until the 1990s. But for the moment, there is what is known in the region as the free and open Indo-Pacific space. Control of Taiwan for China would give it control over that region. And that's why strategically it's important to China, but also why strategically it's important to the US and others that no one controls China. That's a bigger version of the same map, just showing Taiwan's really strategic position in that region. It's the busiest region for maritime trade in the world. Various straits through which a lot of the traffic passes, but nonetheless it is strategically important. What China has done, and this is just part of a map, is to lay a claim to the South China Sea, the sea south of Taiwan, marked by what is known as the 9-dash line, although sometimes it has 10 dashes and sometimes 11. This was a claim first put down by the Kuomintang government of Chiang Kai-shek in 1946, I think. Doesn't represent really a historic claim, but it is a claim that's convenient to China. The claim to the South China Sea overlaps, obviously, the claims of all the other littoral nations. China is seeking to control that region strategically and is engaged in daily battles with the Philippines in particular over ownership of certain reefs and other features in the sea, which China would like to control in order essentially to control the sea lanes and to make sure that their navy is bossed. Obviously, this shows the importance to Japan, if you like, this map, and also jumps me forward to Japan's defense posture. Why is Japan so concerned about Taiwan? Well, partly it's a former colony, but also the sea lanes are very important for Japanese trade. But finally, Japan actually, apart from China, has the nearest land to Taiwan. All those islands coming down, Amami, Okinawa, Miyako, Ishigaki, Yonaguni, are a string of islands known as the Nansei Islands or the Ryukyu that end up 110 kilometers from Taiwan. That gives Japan an enormous interest, but also it means that Japanese forces on those islands, whether in bulk or just as electronic warfare units, are becoming increasingly important in the task of deterring China. And indeed, the new security strategy that I mentioned that was started in 2022 and that has a 5-year defense build-up plan involves the shifting of forces down those islands to be closer to Taiwan, to enable Japan both to detect movement and activity there, but also to play a role should there be a conflict. What's the importance to the United States and to the West? Well, the first importance to the United States and the West is that Taiwan is a flourishing democracy, and that we thought before Ukraine and before Trump started sitting down in Saudi Arabia today, or rather his people did, with Putin, that the seizure of land by force, the changing of boundaries by force, had been ruled out by the Atlantic Charter, by the United Nations Charter, and therefore by international law since 1945. Well, not violating that is obviously a particularly important thing to the West and to the US, but mostly the interest of Taiwan is about the strategic position that it has, and the fact that nobody owns it means that US forces in the region, on Okinawa, in South Korea, sailing through the region, do not feel encumbered or endangered. The US and China clearly feel that they are contestants for global leadership in the 21st century, and they definitely feel that they don't want to let the other one get the military advantage. A big question that is often in the media is whether semiconductors are the real reason why either side is interested in Taiwan, because the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, is the world's leading maker of the most sophisticated semiconductors. 80 to 90% of that output comes from there. But I think that this is a fake issue. It's a fake issue because their factories are on Taiwan, but if they were no longer able to operate there, they would be able to be set up elsewhere. Ideas can be moved. expertise can be reproduced and redirected. And anyway, they dominate not the overall semiconductor industry, but rather the most sophisticated end of it. This is a bit of a fake issue that is used sometimes by American politicians to justify why Taiwan matters. But the real reason why Taiwan matters is military and strategy. So finally, let me just say what I concluded about deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is the deterrence that we grew up with during the Cold War. And the nuclear balance between Russia, China, and the United States is that China has maintained until now what's known as a minimum deterrent. It's actually now got just over 500 deployed nuclear warheads, according to the latest report from the Pentagon, and with evident plans to take it to 1,000, but that would still be a lot smaller than those of China, of Russia, or the United States. So is nuclear deterrence relevant in this? Well, I think it is, because the big question with nuclear weapons is not so much the number of them, but rather, can they be used in a retaliation for a first strike? Can they be used to punish the opponent? And I think it's clear that China's forces are being strengthened in order to make sure that it is clear that nuclear weapons could be used. But our question really after the Ukraine war is whether or not the mere threat of nuclear weapons might actually be enough to act as cover for a conventional invasion or coercion of Taiwan. The strategy of integrated deterrence has been a strategy of building up partnerships by the United States with Japan, with Australia, through the AUKUS deal to build nuclear-powered submarines, and position American submarines in Australian bases, and to build logistic bases in the Philippines. That is what integrated deterrence has meant, and actually American forces now have a more forward posture alongside Japanese forces and are credible as potential interveners in the case of an attempted invasion of Taiwan. But what is it that would actually act as a deterrent? In my estimation, the largest element of deterrence is actually political and psychological. It's really, and I'll just turn this off now, it's really about the credibility of the threat to intervene. Essentially, what Xi Jinping and his PLA, People's Liberation Army people, would think of every morning when they wake up: should we invade Taiwan today? Should we coerce Taiwan today? There are two questions. One is, how strong would be the resistance of the Taiwanese military? And secondly, would the United States intervene? The credibility of the threat of the US to intervene is, of course, the biggest deterrent. Joe Biden 4 times in 2021 and 2022 said publicly that the US would intervene in the case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, even though he had ruled out the use of ground troops in Ukraine. He said, I would use them in Taiwan, in China, in the case of a Taiwan interference. But the biggest question now is, would Trump do the same thing? Is Trump going to repeat that message and keep it consistent? The military capability surrounding Taiwan is important, and big efforts have been made to solve the problems that we've seen in Ukraine, namely the slow speed of support of the beleaguered country, and a low scale of support. The speed and scale of the military support would be very important. And then really the credibility of any coalition that supported would be vitally important. Europe would be part of that coalition, probably, although currently, since the United States is treating Europe as an enemy, it's a little unclear whether politically that would be carried through. But nonetheless, we're only in week 5 of the Trump administration, so we shouldn't jump forward to too many fundamental conclusions about their relationship to allies. But the credibility of the coalition would be important. But the key issue of deterrence is about the credibility of the decision making in the White House and in Beijing, and obviously in Taipei. And then, since nuclear weapons are involved, The question is, how do we get some sort of agreement about the use or non-use of those nuclear weapons of the sort that there was during the Cold War, but of which there is no dialogue currently of any serious nature between the US and China over arms control. I'll stop there because I need to give Mariangela plenty of time to come in and get into questions.
Thank you, Bill. It was fascinating and very clear. So I give the floor now to Mariangela for her comments and question about this quite frightening but super relevant scenario that you painted.
First of all, let me say that I really enjoyed the book. It was a great book to read. So I advise people who are listening to us to read it, to share the book. And for me, as a journalist, is a great instrument. So I really thank Bill for having written this important book. My first comment, I have mainly three comments. My first is about CCP's legitimacy. Bill in his book mentions a lot the importance of words. We tend not to believe, we did with Putin, to what dictators say. Xi Jinping is not at all like Trump in words, is he? He doesn't say, we are invading Taiwan tomorrow. No, he's not the type. But Xi Jinping, he doesn't need to say it because he expects the others to have clear in their minds that Taiwan is his. So we tend in the Western world to embrace what we think, to think that what we think is right. But this is really not the time to do so. It was not with Putin. I agree with Bill when he writes so. And it's not the case with Xi Jinping. We should believe China when Beijing is assertive about Taiwan, and we should know about some, one most important thing, the legitimacy. The Chinese Communist Party legitimacy is largely built on its ability to preserve China's territorial integrity, drive economic development, bring prosperity to people. Xi Jinping doesn't care about United States or Europe. He wants to, try to avoid another Tiananmen incident. That is what matters the most to Xi Jinping in this moment. And the reunification with Taiwan, or at least maintaining pressure for it, is crucial for the government credibility. Given the current economic challenges and the likely deterioration of relations with the US, many Chinese believe the CCP will take action very soon. So on this point, I also agree with Bill, because he says very clearly. There is a passage in the book that I want to read, and I quote, "Repeated assertion that the US and the West are in decline while China is amid great rejuvenation." It was, clear to everyone. Recently, however, another potential framework has emerged, is that with China's population now declining and its structure aging, the era of effortless Chinese economic strength may be over. Also China knows this, and maybe this is really the right time to invade. We don't know, but we have some perspectives on this. So I think this is important because when you have economic power, you also have leverage. We are seeing this in Europe, to make the comparison with Ukraine. Donald Trump doesn't trust Europe and doesn't take Europe seriously because we don't have economic power anymore. And that is leverage. So I think this is one of the main points in the book that I really agree on. Second point is nationalism. The Taiwan issue is deeply tied to broader nationalist sentiments within China. Since 1949, and we saw the timeline that Bill showed us. I mean, even Ireland is more British than Taiwan is Chinese. So, and Bill writes this in the book. Chinese citizens since 1949, they have been educated with the narrative one China, two systems, which is central to the country's identity. When I was there, it was always, repeated, yeah, one China, two systems. You have to write it, you have to write it. It's hard to see this narrative changing under this actual CCP, making it difficult for the government to back down on the issue of Taiwan. Bill, in his book, he mentions a documentary that the PLA uses so much to reassure domestic Chinese audiences that on the 96th anniversary of its founding, the PLA is well prepared to fulfill the national ambition of unification. Because this is what Beijing does in this moment. I mean, try to reassure the Chinese people that this dream of unification is always there. Third point, one country, two systems. Many Chinese still believe that one country, two systems policy, as I was saying before. This is what's seen as a potential model for Taiwan's unification. Prior to events like the 2014 Hong Kong umbrella movement, this was considered a success. However, now the one country, two systems model is seen as hypocritical, because when I ask to my Taiwanese friends, they say, okay, what one country, two systems after 2014, especially given the failure of democracy in Hong Kong. So this makes very difficult to convince Taiwan of its viability. And even when I listen to William Lai, the Western name of the new president in Taiwan, and he says, oh, I want to give you independence. I think about the Taiwanese listening to him, having the Hong Kong example in front of their eyes. I mean, how can you trust him? To move forward this situation, I think that CCP will need to offer a better deal, something more appealing than the Hong Kong example. In Taiwan, I think most of them prefer Taiwan to be independent, but they fear to say it because they know there will be military conflict they don't want, and they do prefer a sort of status quo. And also this is well underlined in the book. I agree with Bill with the economic issue. I don't think it's a fake issue. And I stop here, and I want to ask this question to Bill, if I may, Stefano. First question to him. I agree. I don't think it's a fake issue. I think that even the instruments and the mobiles maybe people are using to watch us now in this very moment, they have Taiwan semiconductors chips, so I'm sure about it. But I do think not only the ideas can move, but even the factories, they can move. And I want to say that 2 years ago in Arizona, there was this big inauguration of Taiwan semiconductor factory. And Joe Biden was there. Tim Cook of Apple was there. And also the president of TSMC, the big and myth, Morris Chang, was there. So I think that this was made in order to say, look, if we have something in the horizon, like, for example, another COVID, or we have a crisis, okay, we are just opening another door, and we have Taiwan Semiconductor at home, and it's a start, and it's a beginning. So maybe we will have something like this also in the future. So my first question to Bill is this one. This book is about deterrence. At the end of the book, you also mention some useful and identified deterrence strategies. Can you just summarize them and tell us what these strategies are? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mariangela, for very, very, very interesting, good, excellent comments. I mean, first of all, let me just add on the point of the semiconductors before going on to deterrence strategies. I think that clearly the strategy of Taiwan Semiconductor is to invest abroad. I mean, they're building a big factory in Kyushu in southern Japan, in Kumamoto province, which the Japanese are delighted to say is going to be producing chips sooner than the one in Arizona, because they think they're more efficient at building a factory and getting it going than the Americans are. But they're also doing the factory in America. Japan and Korea are also investing a lot in this other semiconductor industry. So it's an industry that's always developing and always changing. And while it clearly makes no sense to be super dependent on one small island as the sole supplier of the most sophisticated chips, and that is a risk that every supply chain manager should be thinking about, to say, how do I diversify away from this risk? I don't believe that it's actually a likely cause of war, is the why I think of it as a fake issue, in that I don't think that China is so desperate for the most advanced semiconductors that this argument that we must get those factories would overcome all other obstacles or barriers to make them want to capture this island, because as I say, intellectual property is mobile, factories are mobile, technology is always changing. And anyway, China is showing that it can actually produce a lot of very sophisticated goods and do AI in a super efficient way with DeepSeek without TSMC chips, without the most advanced chips. So I think it's not a critical issue, but it's clearly important to the economy of Taiwan, and the economic prosperity of Taiwan, and Taiwan as a part of the global supply chain is clearly a very important thing. Moving to deterrence strategies, I think that, I mean, the key thing that I wanted to stress in the book, at the end of the book, was how two things were vitally important in the Cold War that meant that we survived. One was actually consistency of policy, both in America and the Soviet Union, from government to government, from administration to administration. Of course, there were minor differences between Nixon and Ford, Ford and Carter, Carter and Reagan, over policy towards the Soviet Union. But the core of policy was consistent and highly predictable from the point of view of the other side. And a big problem that we face with the Taiwan issue, with the US-China issue, is that policy towards China is still too inconsistent as between administrations. It may be that this is just a transitional point, and that it will become consistently tough and firm and predictable over the next decade. But I worry that one of the weaknesses of Western deterrence is actually the uncertainty surrounding what the American position would be, and alongside that, what the Allied position would be. I mean, what the European position would be. Emmanuel Macron, going on a visit to China, said we should not involve ourselves in other people's crises, as if to imply the Taiwan crisis would be somebody else's crisis rather than Europe's as well. So that's a kind of message of inconsistency to me. So one part of a crucial strategy is to achieve consistency, at least of core messages. But the second issue is about arms control and about an understanding of the role of nuclear weapons. And I don't want to come all Dr. Strangelove on this seminar, but I do think that actually the credibility of the potential use of nuclear weapons is an important part of a deterrent strategy. Putin, I'm afraid, used it for his purposes in Ukraine, and I think that the US will be wanting to use it vis-a-vis China and Taiwan in the future. And if it does so, and if China perhaps does so, what they really need is a framework of arms control and transparency that prevents this from escalating suddenly in an atmosphere of mystery and misunderstanding. So the second lesson of the Cold War is get treaties, get arms control treaties, and they're all about verification and transparency, and that acts as a basic framework around the issue. I shouldn't take up any more time, but the final point I'll make is the big conundrum about Xi Jinping, to my mind, is not about his words, which are indeed, as you say, extremely clear what his intentions and aspirations are. The conundrum to me is the question of whether he is a risk taker or whether he is naturally risk averse. He and the administration are naturally risk averse. Putin and Russia are clearly risk takers. They believe in bold actions. China has not so far done that under communist rule. And Xi Jinping looks to me like he's risk averse. And therefore, that would make me happier about his likelihood of actually carrying out his words on Taiwan. But I might be wrong. I'll stop.
I just want to add that in your book, another interesting part is about the psychological side of the dictators, right, Bill? When
Yes.
you say, when you have that power, sometimes it's really difficult not to want to have more power. And that also makes me a little bit frightened about what's happening. Sorry, just want to add.
Mariangela, your camera went black. Okay, now you're here again. Okay. Okay, may I ask a follow-up question about the interesting question that Mariangela raised and the idea of consistency of the deterrence narrative? My impression is that probably we are facing in Europe a problem where, how to say, the necessity of an open and frank debate between players, institutions, and national governments radically conflict with the necessity of a consistency narrative. I mean, Olaf Scholz, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, now he's in the final days of electoral campaign, and basically everything he says at the Paris summit at international level is related to his necessity in domestic politics. But what he says basically undermine any deterrence approach, because if he says we are not ready to send boots on the ground, then other European players cannot say we are ready to do so, because one member state is enough to prevent, especially if that member state is Germany, to prevent such an action. So do you see that there is a specific European problem in building up a deterrence strategy, while the US are more, how to say, compact in moving in that direction?
Yes. No, I think there is definitely a specific European problem because that Europe has essentially relied on the US to take the lead. And when it has put boots on the ground in certain places, other members of NATO have done so, although not necessarily all of them, such as in Afghanistan, such as in the Balkans, in Bosnia, and Serbia, Kosovo. Obviously, in Iraq was, maybe the notorious case, but it's very much been a part of American leadership. The cases where France or Britain has acted as the lead, even then over Libya, for example, they required American support with technological capabilities and so forth. So we don't have a leader that then others can follow currently in Europe. And that's going to have to evolve in some way. I can't see a European army being developed in a short time, but eventually some sort of centralized command structure may become necessary.
Mariangela, we have time for a couple of other comments and maybe a couple of questions. If I remind people who are interested in writing questions in the chat or raising their hands. But in the meanwhile, Mariangela, if you have anything to add, you have time.
Another very quick comment, and maybe I also want to have Bill's answer on this, because in the book, it's also underlined the importance of the people. For example, President Zelensky and Ukrainian people and their reaction to the war, which I found very interesting. The citizen, Bill, I don't think Taiwanese people would react in the same way. Maybe because when I was there, I noticed sort of cultural differences, of course, but in general, Chinese people, and in some ways also Taiwanese people, have a strong sense of hierarchy. So, for example, the secretary doesn't do anything if her boss doesn't tell her to do anything. So there is a sort of a structured hierarchy in the organization that guides decision making. Well, Hong Kong proved they would take to the streets in a pacific way. Maybe the situation in Taiwan would be slightly different. So I wonder, what is your thought about it?
Well, it is hard to predict
Yes,
whether the Taiwanese people would join in a resistance
yeah.
to an invasion or not. My argument in the book was that Ukraine's resistance then acted as a kind of legitimator or validator to other countries to supply and support it. So will Taiwan's people do that? I think, first of all, Ukraine, it wasn't predictable. It wasn't certain that they would do so, although they had had a long conflict in the East since 2014 that made it likelier, as it were, sensitized the people to the hostility that was there. Secondly, I think in Taiwan's case, I mean, it's clear what public opinion thinks, that it doesn't want unification, that it feels more Taiwanese than Chinese identity, that it just wants the status quo. Would it fight? Well, quite a lot of people are joining self-defense training courses and doing self-defense training, according to reports. But still, out of 23 million, it might be 1 million that have gone through those courses now, on maybe perhaps at the optimistic end of the range. Maybe if an invasion doesn't happen for 5 years, you might have had actually then a pretty large number. So I think timing is very important. I definitely think, and just to go back to the one country, two systems notion, this was an idea that was developed in the 1970s for Taiwan, and then later applied to Hong Kong, as Mariangela knows better than I do, I'm sure. And definitely the Hong Kong experience has told Taiwanese people that they definitely do not want to be absorbed by an authoritarian China, because within a short amount of time, they feel that they would be repressed in the same way. So one fear of Taiwanese is that many of them would then emigrate. Now, out of 23 million, how many can emigrate? Perhaps not that many, but nonetheless, there'd be some problem of flight by those who would be afraid. But the key issue is whether America will intervene and help them or not. I think the likeliest scenario is really a coercion, a blockade, a slow buildup of pressure on Taiwan, probably combined with an improved offer, as you rightly said. And then the question is, would America intervene in that coercion rather than invasion position? And that's what's the biggest uncertainty to me.
Thank you.
Okay, Bill, we have a comment from our director, Daniel Gross. He says that until recently, China has had as much a smaller nuclear arsenal than the US or Russia. So far, at least, China seems to have put little emphasis on the nuclear element. Is this an evolving approach to nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons?
It seems to be changing, Daniel. Every year, the Pentagon produces something called the China Power Report, which is delivered to Congress. And each of the last several years, it's shown a much increased estimation of the number of Chinese nuclear warheads. They've essentially doubled in the last 5 years. And the Pentagon, at least, reckons that they will be at 1,000 within quite a short space of time. I think by 2030 is their latest one. They detect a lot of silos being developed and built in parts of China, and they don't know, because there's no transparency, they don't know whether these are conventional missile silos or nuclear silos. So it seems that the nuclear force is expanding. It's unclear why it's expanding. It's unclear what strategy lies behind that expansion, whether it's a defensive strategy or a coercive strategy. One thing one should mention is that while the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is rightfully important, a big problem for Xi Jinping and the authorities is corruption. And he has purged some leaders of the nuclear force and the rocket force, as it's called. He's also gone through several ministers of defense who have been appointed and then quickly removed, and also several senior military figures in the past 12 months. So while they are seeking to expand in certain areas and indeed expand their conventional forces at the same time as nuclear, they also face a big problem of corruption and of discipline, and therefore morale, I would say, within the military structure.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, we have very few minutes for very final comments. Mariangela, do you have a final comment? So we give Bill the opportunity to answer his last.
Well, if you all agree about the conclusion, because I find this conclusion very efficient. The author says, this author, Bill, will sleep more easily once it becomes describable by all sides, this sort of conflict, of course, as inevitably catastrophic and therefore inconceivable. Because you say, Bill, this is not at all like the Cold War, and you mentioned also this before, but we also can try to learn some lessons from the Cold War. And I found this last sentence, well insert in that direction.
Well, thank you. And in a way, this links to Daniel's question. I think,
yeah, it does.
In some ways, the fact that China is building up its nuclear forces, I would see it as a good sign, because I think that we may be seeing a developing understanding that any conflict between the two greatest superpowers in the world would inevitably carry a risk of absolute catastrophe. This is not a question of the sinking of one or two ships in the South China Sea. This is something that would become, I think, absolutely catastrophic, and which is why also I think economic estimates of the economic damage from such a conflict, while they are interesting, they are kind of beside the point. The fact is that we would risk absolute catastrophe from a conflict between the US and China, and that's more true the stronger China becomes in its nuclear forces. And so I think that we have to hope that we are in a transition to a period when you have both a more consistent American policy alongside the pretty consistent Chinese policy, as Mariangela rightly said, and transparency and talks around nuclear weapons that acknowledge the fact that the conflict would be so catastrophic that it has to be made inconceivable. And that's the hope that we should finish this wonderful webinar with. I think Mariangela's very kind to read out that last sentence of the book.
Well, Bill, another very quick and last thing. If you manage to publish the book in Italy, and if you name it like with the title, How to Avoid the World War III, this is a kind of, title that really appeals to Italian readers. This is very Italian.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent.
we will see. May I take the opportunity for a super final question, because the last comment that Bill made raised me a question. I would like to have the answer. Europe is facing the dilemma what to do with China now in the Trump era, and I found interesting the speech that Ursula von der Leyen made in Davos, when she basically said, okay, China is a systemic rival, but we need to deal with them. So in the framework of deterrence, do you recommend to the EU Commission and to Europe in general to strengthen economic partnership with China, or to keep on de-risking, reducing connections? Because my fear is that if we try to prevent the conflict, reducing the cost of the conflict, we make the conflict more likely.
I think, well, I think that, first of all, I think that Europe must never relax its kind of military deterrence messages. In other words, it should still be sailing ships out into the region. It should be exercising freedom of navigation operations, which German ships, which French ships have done, which you've had an Italian aircraft carrier out in the region as well, just in the past 12 months. I think that no concessions should be made on that, no concessions on relations with Taiwan. But if Europe seeks common cause with China in dealing with Trump's tariffs, I don't see that that's a contradiction. And I think that in some ways that may well happen, that there will be some sort of concerted reaction if the Trump administration decides to push on a universal type tariff regime. And so then, yes, you would have an effort to have a kind of economic partnership with China. But does that actually mean increasing dependency on China? I'd say not necessarily. It just means being realistic about the multipolar and multidimensional nature of the world, that as long as we are not dependent on China for 90% of our supplies of certain key things, we can nonetheless do business with them, just as we should do business with Indonesia and do business with India and do business with Malaysia and do business with others. So I don't think that they're as contradictory as they might seem on first sight. And the way in which the Trump trade policy is going, I think that there is going to be some greater collaboration with China in the next 4 years.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill Emmott, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to Mariangela Pira for her great contribution and comments. I'm glad that we discussed such a frightening topic from a very rational and calm perspective, which is in this time is not obvious, and I think is particularly useful. Thank you again. I recommend you to read Bill's book and to remain connected with the IEP activities via our website, our newsletter, and our new Substack, Substack thing that we launched a few weeks ago. Thank you again, and if you want, we can join again on Monday 24 to unpack the outcome of German election with Wolfgang Munkau, Diane Pieper, and all the other guests. Thank you.